Can you hear me from here? Yeah, good. Thank you so much for the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I am delighted to have this opportunity to briefly introduce the report to you, and I really want to warmly thank the Norwegian Research Council and the Norwegian National Commission for UNESCO for organizing this event. So what I would like to do is just briefly go through some of the facts and figures of the report, the process of producing it, the objectives, who the target audience was, then ask the pretty relevant question, I think, of why a report on this topic from the social sciences and why now. Then I will run through briefly the content of the report chapter by chapter, giving you a little bit of a teaser of what's in it. And I'm sure that our commentators that will follow me will pick up more on that, and then conclude with some key messages that are coming out of the report. Jan, I just wanted to make a correction to one thing you said, every 2 years, but if you look at the size of this report, it's every 3 years, I'm happy to tell you. Okay, so in terms of the process, we did work with an international editorial team and international scientific advisory committee, of which Karen O'Brien was a member. The 150 plus authors that have contributed to the report come primarily through an international call for contributions. Only few pieces were actually specifically commissioned. They cover 23 social science disciplines or interdisciplinary areas of study and all regions of the world. All contributions were subjected to external peer review. We worked with more than 40 reviewers, and I should say that once the report as a whole, the manuscript as a whole was ready, that in itself was sent out to external peer review. So this has been a double peer review process, co-published, as was the first World Social Science report together with UNESCO. And in this case, we were delighted that OECD agreed to come in as a co-publisher, which really extends our reach to governments and policymakers in government. So it is available in print copy and on the OECD iLibrary. By the way, the OECD iLibrary, you can read it for free online, but it had a 6-month embargo which ends in May, and as from May you can download it for free. That also gives you direct access to the data that lies behind many of the contributions. We have set up on the ISSC website an interactive blog where you can criticize the report, congratulate us on the report, tell us what is missing from it, and help to, kickstart this mobilization process, which is really the primary purpose of this report, is to get a social science community, a broader social science community, engaged in this topic. The objectives, very briefly, was, of course, to develop and to articulate clearly a social science understanding of the issue at hand, to showcase some of the unique social science contributions that are already being made, to assess social science capacities to continue making these contributions, and also their capacities to link science with policy and action. We very specifically wanted this report to influence research programming and funding decisions, and to mobilize, as I've said, a wider social science community. And when I say a wider social science community, we are thinking about social scientists working in mainstream social science disciplines, those that are members of the ISSC, who never define or label their work as being related to global environmental change, but who are working on issues that are so pertinent and relevant now to the solutions that we need to find, whether it's about changing social practices, human behavior, understanding governance and decision-making. And those social scientists need to be brought there. The existing social science knowledge is out there. It has a story to tell. It is relevant. It needs to be brought into this. So it's a mobilization vehicle. The audiences, social scientists, of course, in the first place, their colleagues in other fields, natural scientists. Karen, I think, will talk about this new Future Earth initiative where a lot of our colleagues are engaging with this report, understanding what it is that the social sciences bring. International scientific organizations and programs like the ISSC, like the MOST program. What is it that we do? How can we help mobilize this effort? This is not my phone. Somebody's phone is ringing.
It's not mine. It's not mine.
It's a wake-up call. Sorry. Oh, gone. It also made my PowerPoint slide go ahead. Research funders. So we're delighted to be at the National Research Council for Norway. And of course, we wanted very much to reach decision makers, policy shapers, practitioners, and other societal users. This is why we had a very strict editorial policy, which was probably the most challenging part of this report, to get social scientists to write short pieces. And that was interesting. We worked with several editors to help us cut the jargon. I don't think we've done a perfect job, but I think we've gone a long way towards providing insights into social science contributions that are more accessible. So, onto the important question of what makes this report a flagship report? What makes it both timely on the one hand and relevant? Now, I don't need to say much about why it's timely. The ever-growing sense of urgency about actual and unfolding threats of climate change, of biodiversity, of extreme weather events, of other global environmental changes that are threatening the well-being of communities and societies, and particularly vulnerable communities all around the world as we speak. And I'm sure that this will be raised again in the commentary. This makes any knowledge and any contribution on this topic timely knowledge. However, what makes a social science report on this topic so relevant, we believe, are the unique contributions that the social sciences now can and must bring to the table. Make no mistake, our pursuit for global sustainability is a joint effort where we need to work together with our colleagues in other fields of science to ensure that we both protect the planet's resources whilst at the same time safeguarding social equity, human dignity, and well-being for all. Yet, the defining characteristics of today's global realities make the social science knowledge particularly relevant. So what are those defining characteristics that call for the social sciences? First of all, it just no longer makes sense, and you're quite right that Irina Bokova picks this up in her preface. We live in a time where it's just not possible to disentangle problems of climate change, global environmental change, social discontent, poverty, inequality, corruption, to disentangle those and to make them compete for our attention. As you know, and that still happens. There are still discussions, also within the MOST program, Young, you will remember, where some people think we need to solve poverty before we worry about climate change. And today's global reality is that these are interconnected problems. And so it doesn't make sense to separate them. And the social sciences need to help us understand how these problems are all part of single complex social ecological settings and what that means. Unpack that understanding. Secondly, we live in a time when human beings themselves are a defining geological force. Quite simply, global environmental change is about people changing global environments, hence the title of the report. And so people take center stage in the Anthropocene. And we need to understand as social scientists what it means to live and possibly to thrive in this era. What responsibilities and accountabilities that brings with it, but also what opportunities it brings. That's a social science task. And finally, everything we know about today's threats to our natural environment calls for profound social change, for deep social transformation. And we're not sure what that means, what that looks like in different places and in relation to different concrete challenges. So what it means to alter our social systems and our lifestyles in a way that puts society potentially on a fundamentally new trajectory towards sustainable development, that again is a task that the social sciences are particularly suited to undertake. This is what makes a World Social Science report from the social sciences on global environmental change not only timely but hugely relevant. So in terms of the content of the report, we built on a framework that was developed and that I was proud to co-author with Asun, Lyris and Claire. In 2012, the ISSC produced a report called The Transformative Cornerstones of Social Science Research for Global Change. Essentially, what we did in this report was articulate a set of questions that the social sciences, that are social science questions that have to be asked regardless of whatever concrete environmental change problem we are addressing, be it climate change, ecosystems, etc., urban issues, migration, whatever. The idea was that if we want our sciences to contribute to solutions to these problems, then there's a set of questions that we have to ask in order to ensure that those solutions are equitable and durable. And using this framework, this framework informed the chapter headings of the report. So let me go through those briefly. It starts by advancing our understanding in chapter 1 of the report of the real complexities and urgency of global environmental changes. And Karen's contribution to that, for example, really picks up on this notion of understanding the interconnectedness of some of the problems and the need to adopt a systems perspective on understanding those complexities, and I'm sure she will talk more about that. It then goes on to draw our attention to the real-world consequences, the direct and indirect impacts of environmental change for individuals and communities in different geographic, cultural, and personal contexts, really showing by a number of concrete examples how important context is, how impacts of environmental change vary for different communities in different places, and showing also that consequences are not only about the impacts on people's lives, but the impacts of the responses to climate change, the impacts of some of our policy outcomes on people's lives. So an example there would be a nice article by Neil Adger and colleagues on migration, where he talks about migration both as a response, but also as a consequence. So, people migrate to alleviate risk, but often it is the most vulnerable who are not in a position to migrate. At the same time, migration as a policy response to some of the risks of climate change, often those resettlement policies don't take into account people's vulnerability when they get to a new location. So it's looking at those complex consequences for real world and real people's lives in different parts of the world. The report then goes on to examine different visions and conditions for changing individual and collective behavior and social practice. So not just focusing on how do we change our individual behavioral patterns, but how do we change the social practices and the systems and processes in which they are embedded. One of my favorite examples in this chapter is from an evolutionary psychologist who looks at innate psychological tendencies and preferences, like the tendency to prioritize self-interest, to discount the future, to prefer relative over absolute status, to imitate others, and to ignore novel evolutionary threats like climate change. Now, all of these preferences, one would imagine, have quite severe consequences for the environment. But he shows how these can be used in behavioral change campaigns, in sustainability policies, to work in a pro-environmental fashion. So it's, you know, fascinating insights from evolutionary psychology, just as one example. The report then goes on to look at the various conditions and visions for change in a rapidly changing world, really looking at what are feasible future alternatives, how do we make these happen, when is change politically and culturally acceptable or not, politically feasible, etc. Finally, we then move on to examining some of the ethical approaches and concerns about justice in developing policy solutions. And here, and I again hope that Asun will pick up on this, this also includes an understanding of what does it mean to foreground normative agendas also in our scientific practice. And finally, we go on to highlight new approaches to governance and decision-making, to understanding policy processes at different scales, including the role of scientific knowledge in such governing processes. What I find interesting here is that the majority of the contributions in this chapter really emphasize the need for inclusive policy processes, for including also local knowledge, indigenous knowledge. There are fabulous examples of social movements working in the Amazon where there is a growing awareness that people's own narratives and stories and emotions about their environment are as important as satellite images, GIS, mapping, etc., in terms of what counts as evidence for policy making. So that's interesting when we think about decision-making, policy processes, that we also need to rethink what actually counts as evidence and how do we deal in the policy process with messy things like emotions. Finally, the report also assesses and really takes stock, as I've said, of the social science capacities to undertake research on global environmental change. And here, we did a full bibliometric analysis, which is in the annex of the report. But I think one can sum it up in a pretty blunt statement, which is that where this knowledge is mostly needed is not necessarily where this knowledge is being produced. The disparities, the divides in capacities across the world are quite enormous. At the same time, one does see an exponential growth in social science production in this field over the last 10 years, and amazingly in countries like China. The statistics in China of increasing social science production on climate change are quite incredible. And as I said, the annexes are not only the bibliometric analyses of social science research pertinent to this field, but every report, we started this with the first report, also takes stock of some basic indicators on the production of social science knowledge in different parts of the world. We work there with the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, and the idea is that every report will update that so that over time we start really getting a better understanding of social science production systems and use across the world. So to go on to the key messages, one of the ideas that runs throughout the report, and I think it's the title of the final chapter, is global environmental change changes everything. It is the proverbial elephant in the room that we can no longer ignore. Now, let me take a little break here and say that is one interpretation of why we chose elephants for the narrative, the visual narrative. There are many others. One is that it's such a big report and you eat an elephant one mouthful at a time. The other, of course, is that the social sciences themselves in many ways are the elephant in the room. So that was the, we thought it was telling several stories. But global environmental change changes everything. It changes our life support systems. It changes our livelihoods. It changes our ways of life, our actions, and it changes our interactions with each other. It also changes the demands for and on the social sciences. And so the report ends with a bold and decisive call on the social sciences for a new social science of sustainability that is bolder in taking the lead in reframing global environmental change as a social process that is embedded in social systems, both past and present. A social science that is better at infusing social science knowledge into real-world problem solving. One that is bigger in terms of having more social scientists addressing the issue. And one that is different in terms of being more reflective in thinking about how we produce our knowledge and how it gets used. Now, each of these calls, it embraces 4 key messages, and each key message comes with a set of priority actions which are aimed at different target audiences. And I'm not going to go through those, I'm just going to run through the key messages. First of all, that we need to be bolder in terms of framing the change. This means developing our social lenses on issues of climate change and global environmental change to really reveal the social, economic, political, and cultural nature of these challenges. One of the press releases on this report, the headline was, "Climate is not about carbon, it is about people." It's not a physical process, it's a social process. And so this is the framing issue. It also allows us to highlight the role of people, behaviors, practices, and institutions. And I think in doing so, very importantly, it opens up spaces for understanding what opportunities do we have for social innovation, for responses. So it's not all about a doom and gloom story by looking at the social consequences and impacts. The second key message, enable the change, is that we need more solutions that work for people and the planet. Social scientists need to get better at closing the gap between the pace of the changes we see and societal responses, which remain sluggish. We have a role to play in that. And that means that we need to start taking on leading positions, engaging with decision makers. One of our priority action steps to policymakers is on their Rolodex is to have some social scientists on there so that when you're setting up advisory committees, bring on board the social scientists. We need to work with societies in very specific localities, in specific social ecological settings where problems are being experienced. And we need to understand what it means to build open knowledge systems and networks of mutual learning. Social scientists have a role to play in creating those knowledge arenas where other societal stakeholders become knowledge partners because they carry relevant knowledge. Building capacity for change refers to increasing research production in the first place, both in terms of human capital, but also in terms of institutional resources, and organizations like UNESCO are also ideally placed, given their political convening power, to also build resources at the systemic level. It's often very difficult for funders and institutions like ISSC to do this. It's also about building critical mass and communities of practice in regions of the world where these do not exist strongly enough. It's building capacity to communicate effectively. And very, very importantly, we are not advocating here in the report to just produce new knowledge, more knowledge. We are saying it's the capacity to use the knowledge we already have. And there's a lot of it in the social scientists. And it is building capacity for social scientists to take the lead in developing integrated, solutions-oriented research, in framing what that research should be, in working with societal stakeholders, in co-designing those problems. Not for social scientists to wait to be invited to come on board towards the end of processes, but for us to have that capacity to take the lead in this. And finally, a strong call and a slightly controversial call to the social science community to say, come on, let's be the change. Let's practice what we preach. Let's embrace interdisciplinarity. You know, when we organize, Goodman, you know, when we organize a World Social Science Forum, that's a tough challenge to get the disciplines to set up panels that are interdisciplinary, to integrate across scales, to build bridges across different forms of knowledge. We talk about co-design and co-production with societal stakeholders, but we need to get serious about this, and not just us. I think the funding community, the policy community as well, and as I say, engaging with policymakers, practitioners, civil society, or activists, not as witnesses or as sources of data, but as active knowledge partners, and building networks, longer-term networks of mutual learning that can grow and develop homegrown solutions in particular concrete settings. In conclusion, the World Social Science Report is not a comprehensive review of what's out there in the social sciences. This took us 18 months to produce. We would have needed, how long does the IPCC take? It's not a review. It is a starting point. It's a starting point. It gives you a flavor of the kind of work we need to do. It articulates a knowledge agenda for the social sciences, and it is a basis for discussion. Again, we have an interactive blog. There are things missing. There are authors missing. So we want the community to really use this as a starting point, as a point of rallying those social scientists who are sitting, working on change, on ethics, on justice, on decision-making systems, on governance institutions, who never thought of themselves as having anything to say about climate change, but in fact they do. And so it's a point to bring them on board. I'm very delighted to say that we are moving in the right direction in terms of using this as a rallying point. So one of the direct outcomes of this work and of the work, the preparatory work that's gone into the report, is that the ISSC has now launched a new global funding program on transformations to sustainability. The call for seed funding was issued on the 31st of March, so just a week ago or so. And you will find the details on the ISSC website. This program is intended to provide social science researchers with the resources that they need to respond to the kinds of policy imperatives that we are talking about. Integrated research, co-designed research, working with societal stakeholders, all of that takes time, money, it takes support, it takes encouragement. So we want to set up and fund a series of transformative knowledge networks that are solutions-oriented, that allow social scientists, as appropriate, to bring in their colleagues from other fields, to bring in your star theoretician when you need him or her. And it's an experimental program which the Swedish Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, has very generously, and I think in a visionary manner, worked with us to support. We have discussed it with some of the national funding agencies that come together in the Belmont Forum. Initial reactions are positive. So I draw your attention to the call for seed funding, and I encourage those of you interested to work with us on this. Thank you very much for your attention.